remember when Marvel was trying to replace the X-Men with the Inhumans? It seems like a distant memory today, but there was a time when Marvel was actively trying to push the Inhumans while suppressing the X-Men. We all know why it happened. They didn't have the film rights, and as a twisted form of revenge against Fox, they stopped putting the X-Men in merchandise and games. The comics were given the unenviable task of trying to make the Inhumans into a commercially viable property. It resulted in one of the most bizarre eras of X-Men comics, and since I recently read through this era all over again, I wanted to take some time to really dig into what the comics did and how it ended up being such a huge disaster. This bizarre era truly began in 2016 after the massive Secret Wars event. But there was one major development before Secret Wars that served as a catalyst for everything that was to come. The 2013 Infinity event, Black Bolt detonated a Terrigen bomb. The bomb unleashed the Terrigen Mists across Earth. If you aren't aware, the Terrigen Mists are responsible for making Inhumans. Inhumans undergo the Terrigen ritual by passing through the mist to gain their inhuman form and powers. As soon as they were unleashed on Earth, they ended up activating latent inhuman genes and turning many humans into inhumans. Black Bolt did this in an effort to stop Thanos, but it ended up having unintended consequences on mutant kind. After Secret Wars, we were introduced to a brand new status quo for the X-Men and the Inhumans. The Inhumans were thriving, with new Inhumans being born almost every second as the mists made their way across different regions of Earth. The X-Men discovered that the mists were dangerous to mutants and had sterilized mutant kind. Storm formed a team of X-Men who relocated to the Hell dimension of Limbo, taking mutant refugees with her. She also established a peace treaty with Medusa, the queen of the Inhumans, and an agreement to relocate mutants before the mists arrived at a given location. Despite these efforts, several mutants still contracted mpox and suffered from illnesses or even death. Magneto formed his own X-Men team to handle threats left behind on Earth and was displeased with the idea of being on the defensive. The original time-displaced X-Men operated independently during this period. Meanwhile, a mystery was created around Cyclops and Emma Frost. They were completely absent when this era began, with various books going so far as to refer to Cyclops as Mutant Hitler. Almost every mutant, and inhuman and human, was shown to hate Cyclops for something he had supposedly done. The assumption was that he had committed such a terrible act that none of his friends could defend him and that the entire world had turned against him because of it. I do want to reiterate that most of the books during this period were actually quite solid. Despite the weird air of uncertainty around them, most of the all new, all different era X-Men titles were actually pretty decent. I particularly enjoyed Cullen Bunn's Uncanny X-Men series and the Laura Kinney all new Wolverine series by Tom Taylor. Laura was one of the few mutant characters who genuinely thrived in this era. Marvel eventually announced the Death of X miniseries. When it was first revealed, speculation ran wild about what it really meant. Some even theorized that Marvel planned to kill off the X-Men entirely because of their ongoing push for the Inhumans. Today, that sounds ridiculous to even consider, but at the time, it seemed like a real possibility. Death of X turned out to be a prequel to the all new, all different era of X-Men comics. It promised to reveal what had happened to Cyclops and Emma Frost, and what exactly Cyclops had done to earn the hatred of the entire world. Then we got the big reveal that Cyclops had committed the unimaginable horror of destroying one of the inhuman clouds that was killing mutants. That was it. That was the big twist. If you're wondering why we were supposed to hate Cyclops for that, and why his closest friends would hate him for destroying a cloud that was actively killing mutants, I honestly do not know. The story never bothers to explain any of it. Cyclops is murdered in cold blood by Black Bolt in the aftermath, and shockingly, no one seems to care. During the entire all new, all different era, we had not seen a single mutant show any real emotion about the death of a man who had been their leader, savior, and friend for years. As for the rest of the world, the only explanation we get is that stories can be distorted by the world, which is why Cyclops ended up being so hated. If you think that's a cop out, you're absolutely right. I genuinely believe Marvel originally had something more controversial planned, but decided to make it tame after seeing the backlash. Of course, there's a bigger twist to all of that. You see, Cyclops never actually destroyed the cloud or got killed by Blackbolt. Emma Frost did all of that. Cyclops had already died from the inhuman mist in his own room. Determined to make his death matter, Emma Frost decided to make it seem like Cyclops was still alive. She wanted to give him an epic, heroic death. Using her psychic powers, she projected the image of Cyclops to the world while leading the X-Men to destroy the Terrigen Cloud. She even projected an image of him battling Black Bolt, which led to the illusion of his quote-unquote murder. Her actions were responsible for staving off the horrible effects the mist was having on mutants. I actually loved that. It felt like a twisted but touching tribute to Cyclops, a weirdly beautiful act of romance from Emma Frost. In a way, she was the unsung hero who had destroyed the cloud and secured the future of mutant kind for the foreseeable future. But considering what followed, I almost wish it had never happened. There is a glaring example of how Marvel had no idea what they were doing and were just making it up as they went along. The Extraordinary X-Men series, we see Magic condemn Cyclops and hate Sunfire for their roles in whatever Cyclops supposedly did. Considering Magic had always been one of Scott's most loyal teammates, it was clear something was supposed to have gone terribly wrong. But when Death of X finally came out, Magic was shown working with Cyclops, well, technically Emma posing as Cyclops, and Sunfire from beginning to end. She was aware of the plan to destroy the Inhuman mist and clearly supported it. So if she was part of that plan, why was she shown hating them earlier? The inconsistency is almost comedic, especially since both books were written by the same writer. Apparently, even he forgot what he had set up by the time he wrote Death of X. If you ask a Marvel fan to list some of the worst Marvel stories of all time, Inhumans vs. X-Men is almost guaranteed to be in the top 5 or at least the top 10 if they even remember that it exists. It's easily one of the worst Marvel event stories ever made. It started as a mess and ended as an even more horrible one. Somehow Marvel thought that pitting mutants fighting for their survival against Inhumans fighting for the right of random people to get powers made for a balanced conflict. Add to that the fact that most Marvel fans are X-Men fans who are always going to side with the mutants, and you had a doomed concept from the very beginning. The catalyst for the event is Beast informing the X-Men that the Inhuman mist is going to expand and render Earth uninhabitable for mutants. The frustrating part is that Inhumans vs. X-Men could have been great. A conflict emerging as a result of mutants slowly dying out, while Inhumans grow in number and gain social acceptance is a great premise for a story. But Marvel completely fumbled all of it. So much of it didn't make sense, and so many details were simply ignored. Storm had a good relationship with Medusa and was consistently in contact with her. Yet out of nowhere decides that enough is enough and declares war against the Inhumans without even attempting to talk with them. Beast, who had spent significant time among the Inhumans and built friendships there, should have served as a unique bridge between both groups. Instead, he's tossed into a cage and disappears for pretty much the entire event. What was even the point of all that setup? Absolutely nothing. Rogue, who had opposed the war against the Inhumans and had experience working with Inhumans during her time with the Uncanny Avengers, could have also served as a unique perspective in this kind of story, but ends up doing nothing of consequence. Even the idea that every mutant would somehow be on board with waging war against an entire species is absurd. There wasn't a single dissenting voice, and that was hard to accept. The funny thing about Inhumans vs. X-Men that most fans ignore is that from a narrative standpoint, the X-Men were actually the villains of the story. Yes, their species was on the brink of extinction, and yes, the audience rooted for them. I did too. They're far more beloved than the Inhumans could ever be. But if we look at it narratively, they broke their peace treaty with the Inhumans, failed to communicate their reasoning, and just launched a full scale attack expecting to be morally justified. It's such a poorly written event. Inhumans vs. X-Men started off as a mediocre event. It wasn't exactly terrible, but it wasn't exactly good. It was just painfully average until the final issue. That's when it truly became a disaster, and that's almost entirely because of what they did to Emma Frost. Emma Frost was the hero who saved mutant kind by destroying the first Terrigen Cloud, even if she did it by protecting Cyclops. In Inhumans vs. X-Men, she returns to rally the X-Men and leads the fight against the Inhumans to destroy the second cloud. Her leadership drives the entire X-Men war effort, but just as her efforts lead to victory, the writers decide to ruin her character. The conclusion tries to paint Medusa as a kind, understanding queen who simply needed to be told that mutants were dying, as if she didn't already know that the clouds were killing and sterilizing mutant kind. Almost as if Marvel wanted to silence any Emma Frost was right discussions, they turned her into a crazy villain willing to use Sentinel. Emma Frost using Sentinels. Anyone familiar with her character knows how blatantly that contradicts her history. It was a complete betrayal of the character. Decades of character development were tossed out to revert her to her outdated 1980s role of a crazy supervillain for no clear reason. To make matters worse, she was given a ridiculous new villain redesign and labeled Mutant Enemy Number 1. Marvel stuck with this take for a while despite major backlash until the Krakoa era finally arrived and mercifully threw it all away. No Scott, no Logan, no Jean, no Emma, no Xavier. Pretty much everybody who had led the X-Men were gone except for Storm. You'd think that they would have used this golden opportunity to push Storm as the ultimate leader of the remaining mutants. Instead, she was portrayed as an extremely incompetent and passive leader. She barely stood up to the Inhumans. All she did was retreat instead of fight back. Storm taking bold steps to ensure a future for mutant kind could have been incredible. She could have emerged as the hero who saved mutant kind. But even in the aftermath of Inhumans vs. X-Men, they completely abandoned that. They do not try to even push Storm as a leader. They just have her quit and ask Kitty Pryde to be the new leader. Kitty Pryde, who was frolicking in space when her species was facing extinction. She comes back and immediately becomes the new leader of the X-Men, and almost nobody has a problem with it or calls her out on it. Like I said, it was such a strange era for the X-Men. The Inhumans vs. X-Men era will always be remembered as one of the weirdest periods in Marvel history, even though most fans have already forgotten about it or want to forget about it. It was a painful reminder that comics are often dictated by corporate agendas rather than creativity. If Inhumans vs. X-Men had simply been a bad story that a writer tried to make work and failed to do so, that would have been more forgivable. But it was the result of Marvel's corporate goals driven by their film rights issues rather than storytelling. No one really blames the writers involved, they did what they could under such tight restrictions. The post Inhumans vs. X-Men relaunch Resurrection brought a more traditional and safe status quo for the X-Men. While some books were fine, it was overall a very forgettable and directionless era. The X-Men books wouldn't fully recover until the Krakoa era of X-Men, which finally gave the franchise the bold new direction it desperately needed. In the end, Inhumans vs. X-Men was simply a strange, disappointing chapter in Marvel Comics history. The Inhumans were written so poorly that it was impossible to even root for them. The whole period felt like a forced attempt to villainize beloved X-Men characters like Cyclops and Emma Frost and promote their inferior replacements. Luckily, it was so forgettable that both writers and fans quickly moved on from it. Today, aside from a handful of decent books, no one really brings up this era of X-Men comics. Still, revisiting how it all unfolded was a fascinating look back at one of the most bizarre times in X-Men comics.